things happening, that all these unfair things to all these people, it's not fair, and then you know what, this isn't fair to me either. And then he gets to thinking to himself, you know what, I could go by there tomorrow afternoon, because it's always slow between whatever times, and I could go in there and I could take that guy out and I could rob the store. Now has he sinned? Yes or no? You decide. Then the question is, he's driving by that place late at night, still hasn't acted on what he thought, drives by late at night and says, you know what, if I ever get a chance, I'm going to take that place down. And he keeps driving. Has he sinned yet? We've got all these nodding heads. But at what point, if you think he's sinned? Because he hasn't acted on any of it yet. He hasn't done it yet. Now I want you to listen. Just because we think something doesn't make it sinful. Because you drive down the road and thoughts pop in your mind all the time. That's not a sin. Biblically, that's not sin. It's not sin just to think it. Okay? Just because something pops in your mind. We all have random thoughts that pop into our mind. Doesn't mean we sin. It's just a thought. Now if we take the thought and we start to dwell on it, because one of the scriptures says we're supposed to take every thought and make it captive and obedient to the, what? Law of Christ. Okay, so to dwell on the thought, now we're getting in dangerous territory. So for him to think to himself on the way home, I could rob that place, that's not sin. For him to sit in his recliner watching ESPN or watching Fox News and become depressed, and for him to say, I got a plan. Has he sinned yet? No. He has not sinned. The sin occurs when he says, I would if I could. Sin is a deliberate act of the will. I need you to understand this. Sin is an intentional, deliberate act of the will. And once our heart is involved, we've sinned. Once we've decided, if I could get away with that, I would. Now we've sinned. So it's not sin to think it. In a sense, it's not even sin to dwell on it and think it through, because he hasn't done anything. But now his heart is saying, I got a plan, and I got now. If I could get away with it, I would. Now there is sin. And this is important as we talk through the next 3 or 4 subjects in the Sermon on the Mount. Now there are mistakes that we make, but sin is not a mistake. Sin is not, oh, well, I goofed. There are a lot of us, we trip into sin, but there are some of us that dive headfirst into it. Okay? Okay, sin is not a mistake. Now some mistakes are sinful, but by definition, sin is not a oops, I goofed. Okay? It's not the, I went to the movie and there was this scene that I didn't know was in there. That's not sin. Sin is, I know it's in there and I'm going to go anyway. Okay, there's an act of the will involved. Okay, there's a difference between deliberate, intentional acts and impulsive, responsive acts. There's a difference, even in biblical terms. Just like last week we talked about degrees of murder. Remember Jesus said it's not enough just to want to not kill the guy. You shouldn't even want that because your heart's involved. Okay? By definition, sin is an intentional act of the will, and that's why Jesus focuses on people's hearts. Because if he can change your heart, he can change your behavior. So if he can change the way you think, he can change the way you feel. If he can change the way you feel, he'll change the way you act. There's not one time you can find in this section of teaching where Jesus confronts the behavior. What he confronts is the ulterior, the heart, because that's where it starts. And if he can change your heart, then he can change the way that we behave. And so what he says to these, he's in this process, what he's saying to these guys is, it's not just enough to be forgiven. There's other things here at play that you have got to find a way to deal with. For the Jews, forgiveness was very simple. Their idea was, I've goofed, I'm going to find me a sacrifice, I'm going to go offer it to the priest sacrifices the animal, and then God forgives my sin. That was their process. But you need to know this, and you have to believe this, okay? You've got to believe this. Not only do they believe this, but the Bible supports this idea, that if someone has done something wrong, that action has disrupted their relationship with God. And I want you to hear me. It doesn't break the relationship, and it doesn't cut off the relationship, but it damages it. Just like if I do something wrong, it affects my relationship with my wife. It's not ended, but there's damage. Would you agree? Okay, some of us come from the school, the thought that I can do whatever I want and it's not going to bother me and God, but it is. It's like cholesterol in your bloodstream. It's going to be a little bit. Now it might only be a little bit, but you do it enough times it becomes a whole lot. If you do it enough times, it'll clog your arteries and there'll be no connection. There'll be no flow between you and God. Okay? What we do matters, and what we do affects our relationships with God. And so the Jews believed that if I did something that it really affected me. So I had to go find atonement. That's why they used animal sacrifices. So for the Jew, the sacrifice was meant to cure or restore the relationship. Now for us, who is our sacrifice? Christ. Christ is our atoning sacrifice. That's one of the things he's referred to. So for you and I, we go to God and we say, well, the sacrifice has already been made. The blood has already been shed to pay for my sin. I just have to admit that I've sinned. That's part of our process. First of all, keep this in mind. It was never believed by the Jews that the sacrifice could cover deliberate sin. Never. They never thought that if I did something on purpose, that a sacrifice was enough to cover that. And so the Jews tried very, very hard to stay away from doing things deliberately, because there was no way they could be forgiven. There was no way they could be brought back into a right relationship with God. Now you and I, we would refer to this as an abuse of grace. This is the whole, well, I know this is wrong, but I also know God's going to forgive me, so I'm going to do it anyway. Okay? So that's us abusing our sacrifice. But to the Jew, they didn't even have a chance if they knew that they deliberately sinned. If a person did something unintentionally, like losing self-control, then the sacrifice was effective. The sacrifice could pay for that. But if they deliberately, defiantly, callously, and willfully sinned, then the sacrifice was powerless. Why? Because to do something willfully and callously and intentionally, your heart is involved. It's not an action problem, it's a heart problem. And so God is in the heart business. He's not in the behavior business. God wants to give us a new heart. Second, in order for the sacrifice to be effective, it had to include two things: confession and penitence. Now, those of you that come from the Catholic tradition, you know all about that second part, right? And they give you all these things that you're supposed to do in order to get back in graces with God, right? Am I telling the truth? Okay, and I mean, I've heard stories of people who said, well, what you need to do is you need to go give money to this, you need to go do this, you need to go walk around the block on your hands. You're like, how do I do that? Well, like this. Anything. There was a form of punishment, correct? Right? And so, for the Jews, they had to admit what they did was wrong, and they had to be sorry for it, and they had to try to make it right. Otherwise, the sacrifice was worthless. You were just killing an animal. Why? Because those things are heart issues. For me to admit that I'm wrong, for me to admit that I've done something I shouldn't have, that's a heart problem. That's not a tongue problem. That's a heart problem. For example, if a man stole something, let's say that they stole a pitcher of water from their neighbor. If they brought their sacrifice to the priest, and the priest knew that the pitcher of water had not been replaced, they would take the sacrifice outside the temple and sacrifice it, so it was wasted. It was worthless. Because what the penitents would do was, my job was to find you another pitcher of water.